Hi, Candle Echo here. Today I'll be recapping the sci-fi thriller Spiderhead. Story Mode Live. Enjoy the ride. A group of prisoners have been selected to participate in a unique program at the technologically advanced Spiderhead prison on a tropical island. The program offers private quarters, assigned tasks, and recreational opportunities in exchange for participating in experiments on the impact of emotional-altering chemicals. The inmates wear a MobiPack device containing these substances and must give consent before receiving a new dose. The experiments are conducted by Steve Abnesti and his assistant Mark. During one session, Steve administered the chemical G46 to prisoner Ray, causing him to burst into uncontrollable laughter. Despite Mark's efforts to bring the mood down, Ray remained in a state of hysteria. Steve recorded the results and added a star to his notebook in approval. The next day, Jeff was surprised when he was taken out of the facility while blindfolded for a special trial. After receiving a dose of N40 and having the blindfold removed, Jeff was presented with a scene that left him in awe. Despite difficulty in expressing his amazement, Jeff was given a dose of B15, allowing him to fluently articulate his thoughts. Infused with B15, Jeff described the surroundings in poetic terms, but the reality was different. Jeff had actually seen a severely contaminated wasteland. Back at the prison, Jeff formed a partnership with fellow inmate and romantic interest Lizzie while fulfilling their snack-making duties. This interaction allowed them to develop a connection, bond, and exchange stories about their experiences with the experiments. As the day ends, Jeff goes to his room and indulges in his passion for drawing on his Etch-a-Sketch, which brings him comfort but also reminds him of the tragedy that led to his imprisonment. One night, while at a party with close friends Adam and Emma, Jeff became intoxicated and with Adam got behind the wheel of a car. Sadly, his impaired driving resulted in a crash that claimed Adam's life. For the next experiment, Jeff is paired with fellow inmate Heather. To ensure no prior interactions, Steve confirms before asking about their mutual attraction. To his surprise, their interest in each other was only moderate. However, after receiving a dose of N40, Jeff and Heather experience an intense and irresistible physical attraction to each other. In a moment of passion, they succumb to their feelings in front of the cameras and researchers. Afterward, they cuddle and profess their love for each other. Steve and Mark were overjoyed with the successful outcome of the N40 experiment and celebrated their accomplishment. However, Steve exercised caution in his celebration and held off on awarding his signature gold star until he could evaluate any subsequent effects. Later, when Jeff was serving food, he encountered Heather, leading to an uncomfortable interaction between the two. Despite a lack of residual romantic attraction, Steve repeated the N40 experiment, pairing Jeff with Sarah, a mature prisoner who held no attraction for Jeff. Nevertheless, after receiving a double dose of N40, Jeff found himself unable to control his impulses. While refilling Jeff's MobiPack, Mark warned him to be careful during intimate moments as the device was vulnerable to damage from even minor impacts, which could cause a loss of control. Taking advantage, Jeff asked for a change in duties, citing a need for variety, but with a hidden intention. The next day, Jeff was taken aback to find himself at the scientist's desk with Steve and Mark for their latest experiment. There were 2 rooms being used, with Dave in one consuming large amounts of food with short breaks for vomiting. Meanwhile, Jeff encountered Heather and Sarah in the other room. Steve proposes a straightforward challenge for Jeff. He must pick one of the 2 and administer Darkenflox, a substance Steve describes as a harmless agitator. Jeff is uneasy with the task and declines to choose, explaining that if he had to, it would be purely by chance, as he has no particular fondness for either of them. He refuses simply because he had been subjected to the chemical before, and vividly recalls how unpleasant the experience was. Steve finds Jeff's reactions intriguing, as he has undergone varying doses, yet the outcome remains unchanged. Later, Lizzie tries to talk to Jeff about his switch in duties, but their conversation is ended by the prison guards, who remind Jeff that it's his designated day off. Jeff is allowed to take a walk and call Emma, but as usual, he only reaches her voicemail. Jeff leaves a message, expressing how much he misses her and apologizing, mentioning Lizzie's name for the first time. In the next experiment, Jeff is paired with Rogan, a fierce and aggressive inmate. Jeff, who doesn't have any interest in men, worries that he might have to engage with Rogan, so he declines to take any doses. Fortunately, nothing happens, and they are free to leave after a short wait. Upon deducing the situation, Jeff hastened to the scientist's room to verify his suspicions. Heather had been assigned to administer Darkenflox to either Jeff or Rogan, but had chosen not to do so. This indicated that Heather had engaged in a session with Rogan during one of the experiments. Infuriated, Jeff asked if everyone was involved with one another, and Steve presented him with a chart that illustrated the relationships among the prisoners. Steve explained that it was part of the experimental design established by the Protocol Committee, a design that he personally opposed. When Jeff expressed his dissatisfaction with the unethical aspects of the experiments, Steve reminded him that he had voluntarily participated. Fearing the loss of his benefits, Jeff apologized and returned for another session with Rogan. After the experiment, Steve thinks they're close to giving it a glowing recommendation, but Mark is beginning to feel uneasy as well. Steve reassures him, and Mark leaves for the weekend in a more positive state of mind. Later, Steve takes a dose of N40, unbeknownst to the prisoners, as he also uses a Mobipack. While having dinner, Jeff relates the unpleasant impacts of Darkenflox. Lizzie comfortingly grasps his hand and asks why he switched duties. Jeff confides in her that the facility affects his thoughts, and he frequently loses his pre-arrival identity, but when he's with her, he experiences true self. On Monday, Steve took a calculated risk and asked Mark to give him a triple dose of the chemicals. Jeff showed up for the day's experiment and saw this, but the scientists quickly hid the evidence, so Jeff chose to keep quiet. For the following experiment, Steve informed Jeff that they needed to continue with the Darkenflox testing as ordered by the committee. Jeff was hesitant about giving Heather the dose, but Steve encouraged him by mentioning Heather's past infractions and the fact that Jeff was chosen for this task instead of Rogan. Jeff pleaded with Steve to ask the committee to change their decision, but Steve left the room, saying he would make the call but actually went to get coffee and talk with Lizzie. When Steve returned, he lied to Jeff and said the committee wouldn't change their stance and that Jeff must complete the experiment or face being kicked out. Reluctantly, Jeff gave Heather Darkenflox, causing her severe pain. Later, Mark also gave Jeff B15 to increase Jeff's ability to describe Heather's distress, remorse, and lack of attraction. In the heat of the moment, Heather's wild thrashing causes her to hit the wall and break her Mobipack, causing a flood of Darkenflox to pour into her. Her reaction becomes incredibly violent, leading her to shatter a vase and use the fragments to take her own life before Mark can intervene. Both Steve and Mark race to her side, with Steve dropping his keys in the commotion. While they argue, Jeff sees an opportunity to investigate, snagging Steve's keys and using them to gain access to his notebook. He finds several intriguing discoveries. To Jeff's surprise, he finds a formula for OBDX with the Abnesti Pharmaceuticals logo at the top. This revelation means that there is no committee, and Steve is in charge of a private operation. While exploring, Jeff finds a bingo card with gold stars, except for numbers 6 and 40. He discovers that these numbers correspond to the chemicals they have been testing and realizes that N40 is still missing a star since it has not achieved the goal of inducing true love. Later, Jeff sees Steve return and quickly hides the card, tossing the keys back to the floor. Mark pressures Steve to report the incident, but Steve declines. Steve tries to ease Jeff's worries through a well-prepared speech, but it has little impact. Instead, he shares the results of the chemical experiment on Ray, causing uncontrolled laughter and mentioning his own personal story about his father's abandonment during his childhood. Jeff asks Steve why he never leaves the facility, like Mark does, to which Steve simply responds that the project is his true love. Lizzie, the next person undergoing the experiment, is given a chemical that triggers intense phobia, causing her to freeze in fear at the sight of everyday objects such as a stapler. After the experiment, Lizzie opens up to Jeff about her traumatic experience and feelings of shame. Jeff understands and shares his own story of guilt, resulting from a drunk driving incident that resulted in the deaths of Adam and Emma. Jeff and Lizzie embrace and finally kiss, offering comfort to each other. Jeff then begins to plan after observing them eating in the kitchen. Upon reviewing the security footage and discovering Jeff has been sketching Lizzie, Steve confirms his suspicion and retires for the night after taking another dose of N40. The following day, Steve invites Jeff for another experiment to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie. Jeff declines, and Steve allows him to leave unscathed. As soon as Jeff exits, Steve instructs Mark to double his dose of B6. Upon Mark's arrival, Jeff challenges him with the truth that he knows there's no committee and B6 isn't a harmless placebo, but rather the sole chemical Steve is invested in. Mark reveals that he once wanted to work with a brilliant mind and bring about change to the world, but now he has second thoughts. Jeff spots this, and together they hatch a plan before Mark departs for the weekend. The following Monday, Jeff is given the responsibility to administer Darkenflox to Lizzie, but he refuses to do so, much to Steve's anger. Steve, unable to comprehend the bond between Jeff and Lizzie, attempts to convince Jeff to administer the dose by getting Lizzie to reveal her past mistake. She left her daughter in a car, leading to the baby's death. Lizzie cries and pleads for the chemicals, but Jeff presses the control screen. However, Jeff was actually dosed with Darkenflox by Mark, who altered the programming and added extra doses of B6 to Steve's Moby pack. Jeff first exposes Steve to the fear chemical and then gives him Darkenflox. While Steve suffers, Jeff informs him that Mark is coming with the police and reveals the true purpose of the experiment. B6 is a mind control substance designed to make people comply with orders. The product name Obediex is a play on the word obedience. Despite his pain, Steve thinks the chemical has potential for positive purposes, but full obedience hasn't been achieved yet, as the subject's strong emotions can still resist. Steve revealed that Jeff and Lizzie's sentences had already been completed, and they had not been informed. Jeff was enraged and forced Steve to use his fingerprint to unlock the front door so he could leave and inform others of Heather's death. On his way out, Jeff saw Steve reaching for a knife and asked him to hand it over. However, Steve was not influenced by the extra dose of B6, as the chemical was not strong enough to overcome his true feelings. He had previously told Jeff that the project was his one true love and that he would defend it with his life. Steve hits Jeff and steals the control to give Lizzie 4 doses of Darkenflox, which immediately makes her go crazy. Jeff attacks Steve, making him drop and break the control in the ensuing fight, but by pushing him against the wall, he also breaks Steve's Moby pack. The sudden rush of chemicals weakens Steve, giving Jeff the chance to push him away, steal the keys, and run to check on Lizzie. Jeff jumps into action and revives Lizzie's breathing. He then opens her Moby pack and empties out all the chemical bottles. Lizzie feels guilty for not admitting her wrongdoings earlier, but Jeff comforts her and reminds her of his unwavering love. The two of them gear up for their escape plan. Steve activates the alarm and warns the other test subjects that they will lose their benefits if they do not prevent Jeff and Lizzie's plan. Just then, he observes the police approaching the facility through the surveillance cameras. He swiftly gathers as many chemical vials as possible and flees. As Jeff and Lizzie plan to leave, they collaborate to face obstacles posed by Sarah and Ray. Dave tries to get involved, but Lizzie deftly avoids any conflict by giving him the keys to the pantry. The two successfully evade their pursuers and lock the door to the final hallway. Upon exiting, they see that Steve has already departed on his private aircraft, so they quickly board a motorboat and embark on their journey. Mark, along with the police officers in their boats, witnesses Steve's flight. However, he has nothing to fear as the N40 has taken control of Steve's mind. Instead of seeing the mountain in front of him, Steve only sees a stunning view, leading to his inevitable crash into it. As Jeff and Lizzie watch the explosion, they find it amusingly ironic. Jeff comes to the realization that self-forgiveness is a personal journey and cannot be solved easily, but must be undertaken by each person individually.